Hello there, I'm Chuck Todd, and welcome to another episode of Meet the Press Reports. This is where we take a deep dive into a single issue for the entire half hour. Today, it's the Democratic Party and its relationship with the black church. In the 2020 primaries, Joe Biden came in 4th place in Iowa, then 5th place in New Hampshire. The Biden candidacy for the Democratic nomination was all but doomed, until black voters in South Carolina turned the race inside out.
South Carolinians should be voting for Joe Biden, and here's why. I know Joe. We know Joe. But most importantly, Joe knows us.
And with that, black voters turned out in large numbers for Joe Biden, giving him a nearly 30-point win in South Carolina over Bernie Sanders and proving once again the power of the Democratic Party's most loyal constituency. That power has existed since 1966, when blacks across the country lined up as never before to cast their ballots in the first federal election after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That bill was something the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pushed over several presidential administrations to get passed during that long fight for civil rights. Since then, politically active black pastors have consistently wielded the power of their communities at the ballot box by getting souls to the polls, crowning winners with endorsements, and sometimes running for office themselves. But is their power waning in a party that's considered more secular and more elite? And can Democrats win if pastors can't continue to get out the vote at levels that they once did? NBC News Now's Joshua Johnson takes a deeper look.
Keeping voters fired up is not easy while trying to keep yourself warm. It's a cold, rainy day in Milwaukee. Volunteers are knocking on doors, talking to potential voters. They're with the faith-based group Power to the Polls. It's one of many efforts black churches are making to keep people engaged for the midterms. And it seems they have their work cut out for them.
They really just don't trust a system that has disregarded what they feel for centuries.
The Reverend Greg Lewis is executive director of Power to the Polls. He's also assistant pastor at Milwaukee's St. Gabriel's Church of God in Christ. Reverend Lewis says black voters in town can be highly disconnected, even in the recent mayoral election with a black candidate on the ballot.
They asked 25,000 people, do you know there's a mayoral election in your city on April 5th? And 92% didn't know.
92%?
Yes.
That has to be really disheartening for you.
It is.
Particularly as somebody who is in the streets trying to get them to pay attention.
Listen, I'm going to tell you, we have a black county executive in office. We have a black mayor. We have a black treasurer. We have a black city attorney. Most of our common council is black. The opportunity to really grow and develop is here. You know, disheartening is not the word, it's heartbreaking.
Different black ministers are responding differently to this heartbreak. But all the preachers we spoke to said they're acting out of what they believe the Bible would have them do.
If you read the Bible, there's politics in the Bible.
The Reverend Al Sharpton leads the National Action Network, a social justice ministry connecting people of faith to activism.
David was king. That's a political office. Joseph was governor. That's a political office. So where do we get this thing that you cannot be in the spirit of God and in politics?
In Brooklyn, New York, Bishop Leah Daughtry stays active with the Democratic Party nationally. She ran two of its recent conventions, Denver and Philadelphia. The bishop leads the House of the Lord churches, a Pentecostal network of churches with an Afrocentric focus. She says the party can supplement her religious advocacy, but not replace it.
The Democratic Party is a tool. It's a means toward an end. It is not church. It's not designed to be church. They've got their objectives, and I have mine as a faith leader. Sometimes they intersect. Sometimes we're striving for the same things. Sometimes we're not. And so when I size it up, I say the Democratic Party better reflects, not perfectly, but better reflects my values as a Christian than the other party does.
The ministers we spoke to all said their allegiance is to God first. Whoever's politics align with their theology gets their support. And today, those politicians are mostly Democrats. But alignment is not enough. Actions speak much louder, or inactions.
Where do you think the Democratic Party is failing its constituents right now? Any places in particular where you think it's really falling short?
Rural black folk. very rarely hear from the Democratic Party. I think there are forgotten places where I wish we could do more to address poverty, to address systemic exclusion.
The Reverend William Barber II is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. He says the church must speak to how political decisions affect the poor, just as Jesus did.
Whether you're Republican or Democrat, you stand against people having health care. That is a form of injustice and sin. If you are, in fact, Republican or Democrat, and you block living wages while you allow the wealthy to have pornographic sums of money and continue to prosper in their wealth while other folk flounder in their poverty, that is, in fact, sinful. And the role of the church is not to be Democrat or Republican, but to be prophetic.
Reverend Barber says President Biden should persevere on issues of poverty and basic human needs. There are many ways to do that, including through big business. Since 2012, the Barclays Center has been the home of the Brooklyn Nets. That arena serves more than NBA fans. It also serves the community thanks to a unique partnership. The Reverend Herbert Daughtry helped organize that partnership. His activism began back in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. He is also Bishop Leah Daughtry's father. Reverend Daughtry says his neighborhood alliance, just a few blocks from the arena, secured community benefits from the Barclays Center. They range from dedicated upper bowl seats for local groups to support for a community health center.
There's a level of sophistication to that I don't think black folks are ever associated with, right, especially with something that is both business related and political.
Right.
Are maybe the political aspirations in terms of how the Democratic Party and black churches interface, are they too small? Are they thinking too small?
I don't think so. I took the position you do not absolutize your strategy on your way to liberation. You have to use this, you have to use that.
The Barclays Center deal speaks to something all the preachers we spoke to brought up. In their views, people need to see the concrete results of political decisions, things they can point to that motivate them to vote. Reverend Daughtry says the people he talks to are also motivated by something else, their fear over today's increasingly extreme politics.
I think there is a deep, deep feeling among white Americans that they have taken our country and we have nothing to lose, and therefore whatever we do is going to be all right. I think we saw January the 6th in Washington some of this sentiment, some of this feeling that they feel they have nothing to lose. I'm not sure how many white politicians grasp the danger that is out there.
Those concerns may speak to a larger issue that came up in all our conversations, the feeling of being taken for granted. But when churches mobilize, they can reshape elections. But it's not easy to get voters fired up, especially without a big race on the ballot. Reverend Lewis says his own fire goes out often.
Yeah, I quit every day, man. And like you understand, how frustrating it can be. You can't even imagine, because, you said something, man, I'm not responsible for you. But see, that's why it hurts me so much, because I know that I am.
You feel that responsibility. What is that responsibility? Can you elaborate on that?
See, I know these people, and that's why I don't give up, because I can see it. I know one of these days, wow, things are going to be different. I know it. So if I stop now, the blessing God has for us, for me, will be lost. So I can't stop.
Black churches are chasing that blessing as they see it in many ways. So how should Democrats who want their votes chase after them? Reverend Al Sharpton says all politicians need to be real with black voters and say what they really believe, not just what they think voters want to hear.
One of the reasons I had a great working relationship with Barack Obama is from day one. He said, I'm not going to do everything you want me to do, and I'm not going to say everything you want me to say. But I agree with you on these basic things. We're going to disagree with that. And that's
why you liked him?
That's why I liked him, because I said, I can at least trust what this guy says.
When it comes to winning elections, Bishop Leah Daughtry says Democrats need to articulate their accomplishments so voters can remember them.
Look, Joe Biden has created more jobs in his 1.5 years as president than the last 4 Republican presidents combined. How do you tell people that? People know that they're working. So how do you make that a win? How do you make the new roads and the new bridges? How do you make health care, all the things? How do you make cutting child poverty in half a win and let that relate to people's lives every single day so that they feel compelled to see that kind of progress continue and to do their part to make it continue.
As for what to work on next, Reverend William Barber suggests a more holistic approach. Voting rights get a lot of attention, but he says it should be part of an overarching push for social justice.
That's one thing I've learned clearly. You must have a moral fusion approach. You never just allow your position to just be just one thing, like what one thing needs to be changed. You have to show the interlocking injustices and evil require an intersectional response. And as an African-American clergy, you must build fusion alliances.
And as heartbreaking as his activism can be, Reverend Lewis says some things do keep voters plugged in.
You're not going to have elections every year. So there's something else that you need to be generating some energy about in these off-election years. And that's what we've chosen, the housing.
Perhaps it's an issue at the House's Power to the Polls visits. Stephanie Johnson is the group's field coordinator. Knocking on doors can feel uncertain, even awkward, but she says it's worth it.
I am vested in Milwaukee. You know, I've had some tragedies happen here, and I'm vested in making this a better city for us, you know, us of color. Because we've been overlooked for too long.
The rain made for a short day of canvassing. They plan to keep at it ahead of the midterms, doing what they feel called to do. Reverend Herbert Daughtry says his 91 years on this earth have given him plenty to worry about, but not enough to dim his hope. It is one of the promises of the New Testament, a harvest at the proper time for those who do not give up.
This is our legacy. This is what has been bequeathed to us. This is what I teach my children. And as you can probably see from it, is that we are going to win. You are going to be successful. God has programmed you for success. Don't you program yourself for failure.
Recent polling indicates that over the last 15 years, there's been a 21-point jump from 9 to 30% of the number of Democrats who consider themselves religiously unaffiliated. So what does that mean for the party with regards to black voters? Because we can see in a 2020 poll that among religiously affiliated black Americans, 63% are Democrats. But among religiously unaffiliated black Americans, they're far less attached to the party. In fact, nearly half of them, 46% of the unaffiliated, say they're independent. So joining us now to discuss this shift and what it means for Democratic turnout and vote support, it's DNC Chairman Jamie Harrison. Chairman Harrison, it's good to see you, sir.
It's always great seeing you, Chuck.
I'm going to get you to react to a lead from our friends at 538. And it's the framing for our conversation. The 2022 midterms are approaching, and black voters must choose between the Republican Party, which has actively worked against their interests for decades, and the Democratic Party, which has long struggled to meaningfully address race and racism, as well as other issues important to black voters. That is the conundrum. How do you keep black voters excited about the Democratic Party that many think haven't delivered for them yet?
Well, listen, Chuck, I think in the end of the day in November, we're going to see historic turnout in the black community because they understand that this election is about a choice. It's a choice between a party that is built on fraud and fear and fascism, that is banning books written by black authors, that are suppressing the votes of black voters, that is trying to fight against efforts to bring down the cost that could have impacts on black communities. And you have a party that has just, or we're in the process of, putting the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court, a party that worked hard to bring down child poverty and cut it in half and had a disproportionate impact on the black community. And so you have a party that actually gives a damn about black communities and is working hard in order to make the lives of the folks in those communities better each and every day. And so it's about going out, making that case, and letting that be known. And I believe that we can do that. Why do you think we've seen an increase in Republican support among black Americans? Well, listen, I think it's the increase is probably slight, and it all depends on what part of the country you're talking about. You know, the black community is not a monolith. It is also very diverse. And, you know, Democrats have to understand this, that you can't take the black vote for granted. You got to make sure that you fight for it just like you fight for any other vote. And so I think part of what that means is we got to roll up our sleeves a lot more, go into these communities, don't take people for granted, talk about the issues that are important to them and their families and their communities. I believe if we can do that, we will continue to enjoy strong support from the African Americans. Let's talk about the importance of the black church when it comes to the Democratic Party. And I say this because many religious affiliated blacks are not comfortable with abortion, are pro-life. Are you at all concerned that this becomes a bit of a wedge inside the black church at all? I'm not concerned at all, Chuck. You know, the Democratic Party has been on the side of choice for as long as I can remember in politics. And we've enjoyed African-American support just as long, and support from folks and the religious leaders of the black church as well. Because in the end of the day, what this is about is freedom and liberty. Freedom and liberty. And if anybody in this country understands how hard the fight is for freedom and liberty, black folks understand that. And so what we see coming from this Republican Party is a chipping away at all of these rights, not just the freedom of a woman to control her own body, but the freedom to choose who you want to represent you, the ability to have a speech and talk about your experience and not have it be banned. We see that the Republican Party is chipping away at the liberties and freedoms of the American people. Black folks fought too hard and long in order to get our freedoms. We're not going back. When you look at the black church, like every religious institution, it's getting older, and they're having a hard time getting younger folks. And that's going to complicate the Democratic Party's targeting. It's not just looking to the black pastors to get the black vote out, but you've got younger African Americans who don't necessarily aren't as religiously affiliated as many. We're seeing this secularization in general of the Democratic Party. Are you at all worried about, I know you're a man of faith, but this is a party that is less and less attached to religion? Yeah, I think it's important that we go to where people are. If people are in church, let's make sure that we are talking to them about our values in a way that we can in that setting. But if they're not going to church, it's still important for us to go to where they are, in the mediums in which they get their information and how they communicate and talk to folks. Because in the end of the day, even though somebody may not be going to church, that does not mean that they are valueless. There's still values that are core to who they are and how they live their lives and how they're raising their kids. And so the Democratic Party has to continue, whether it's in the religious frame or the non-religious frame, continue to speak to the values of African Americans in the spaces in which they are. You think the party's fought hard enough for voting rights this year? Do you think it looked like to many black Americans that the party in general has fought hard enough for voting rights? I mean, the roadblock that we've run into, it's not the lack of trying. And it's not, I don't even think it's a lack of whether or not we're fighting hard enough. It's the lack of having the votes in order to get it done in the United States Senate. We just don't have 50 votes that will allow a tie for Vice President Harris to break that tie in order to move forward with some waiver of the filibuster. I mean, we know, Chuck, you and I have both been doing D.C. politics for a long time, that if you don't have 60 votes in the Senate, it's very hard to get anything through that body. Jamie Harrison, the chairman of the DNC, big job on his hands. We'll be checking in with you quite a bit. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chuck. When we come back, community organizer, author, and activist Charlene Carruthers is going to add her perspective to this conversation. Stick with us. In July of 2013, the acquittal of George Zimmerman
for the shooting death of Trayvon Martin led to the formation of several racial justice organizations, among them Black Lives Matter and Black Youth Project 100. BYP 100's mission is to build networks of organization for Black youth activism. And our next guest is a founding member and former national director of BYP 100, Charlene Carruthers, who writes in her book, Unapologetic, quote, "When liberals say we need change and moderation, I hear not you and not yet." Well, Charlene Carruthers, welcome. And I want to ask you the same question, which was the last question I asked the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Have Democrats fought hard enough on voting rights? Well, how would you have answered that question? You heard how Jamie Harrison did. How would you have answered it?
Absolutely. Well, Chuck, I think that's a great question to really ponder in a moment where voting rights are connected to so many of the other rights that are on the table right now, that are being struggled around and contended for right now. I would say that as a voter, as someone who has voted for the past almost 20 years, to give my age away, in every single election I could vote in, is that it is impossible. It's impossible for me to fully even understand the depth or the breadth or the commitment to the fight by the Democratic Party due to the way that communication even happens in this country. And what I see, be it in the news or social media or the people who knock on my door, is a party that continues to play lip service at the federal level, perhaps, and not invest at the deep levels that we deserve and that we need on the municipal, the state, and the very hyper-local level.
Look, in October of an election year, I'm guessing when people are knocking on the door looking for black voters, they're saying, we're fighting for voting rights. This is going to be our #1 agenda. And then you see it in action. What does that do over time? Because, look, I've seen the direct mail pieces. I know the conversations that are getting had in October. And, of course, we see what happens when the legislation and the legislating begins.
Mm-hmm. So for me, as a voter, as an organizer, and as a Black person living in this country, I am not a single issue voter. I am not someone who shows up to the voting booth without a whole set of experiences. And as was mentioned earlier, Black people are not a monolith. When we show up to vote, or we choose not to vote or to not engage in the process, it's a highly informed decision. And for me, voting rights is among one of many things that matter. And so I'm not just showing up to vote for someone. I'm looking for something to vote for, something to support. Voting is one of the singular acts that we take in our political lives. And so the Democratic Party and people who represent the party, be it as elected officials or people in the party as supporters, the Democratic Party is bigger than just elected officials, as we know. Y'all got to give us something more than an individual who is looking to matter, and perhaps even a party platform that is looking to matter, but something that we can hold on to, engage with year round. Because elections are every single year. That's not a year that's off. Right. It's not just the federal elections, not just the midterms. There's always something for us to engage in, from the local school board all the way up to the presidential seat.
If a politician only reaches out to Black voters through the Black church, what are they missing?
Well, I have to recognize that first, there is a wealth of knowledge, experience, history, and culture and ways to connect for politicians who do reach out to people who actively participate in the Black church. What they don't get to, if they only focus on a single part of a broader constituency, and I would argue it's not even just a single constituency in talking about Black voters, is that you miss out on experiences, you miss out on communities who have been particularly felt unwelcomed within various specific denominations and churches. I'm speaking very specifically about Black, queer, and trans people who have not felt fully welcomed in these spaces. You're missing out on the folks who have been pushed out, and missing out on people who want to participate in politics in different ways, and people who have different experiences. And so if the Democratic Party, like any smart or sharp political strategy would require would take up, as was noted earlier. Just because you don't belong to a church doesn't mean that you don't have values, that you're valueless.
What should Democrats worry about more when it comes to young black Americans? That they're going to start voting Republican, or they're not going to show up to vote?
Well, Chuck, it's really hard for me to think in binaries. I'm a writer, I'm a historian, and I've organized with young people, young black people all over the country. I think they should be worried about the agenda that they're organizing around and the people that they invest in order to make that agenda real.
Charlene Carruthers, we could go on, but I'm a bit short on time. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective. Your book, Unapologetic, should be something many need to read. Thank you all for being with us. Join us next time for our season finale. We're going to stage a full-scale war game to see what would happen if conflict broke out over Taiwan. How quickly would China raise the threat of nuclear war? Is American territory safe? And after Ukraine, what lessons will American war planners learn for the future? I'll see you next time on Meet the Press Reports, and this Sunday on Meet the Press.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.